Alright, welcome back friends. So in today's video I'm gonna walk you through the process of how I painted this little portrait of Frida Kahlo, and we're gonna find out how and why I painted it, but maybe even more importantly what we can take away from it. So this little painting of Frida Kahlo is something I've been wanting to do for a while now. I just never found the time to actually sit down and do it. Maybe sometime in the future I will turn this into a larger and more complex finished painting, but for the moment I'm pleased that I finally managed to paint this little study at least. So since this is a really small painting surface and I'm painting a very small face, the painting process for this is a bit different from how I approach my large paintings. Painting at such a small scale doesn't leave me with much room for errors. Every brush stroke I make has a huge impact on the painting, and because of that, it's very easy to mess up the whole painting if you're not careful. So I start this painting with the charcoal transfer, and then I go on to paint one part of the face after another. This way I can make sure that I don't have to spend too much time on correcting proportions later in the painting process. Although I'm sure that almost everyone has seen this face before, many of you probably don't know who Frida Kahlo is. So I guess I should take a moment and talk about who she is before we dive deeper into the painting process. Frida Kahlo was a Mexican painter who lived in the early 20th century, and she was, and arguably still is, one of the most important artists Mexico ever produced. A tragic, controversial, but also inspirational figure, even after her death, so many years ago. While being known for her almost surreal portraits and self-portraits, and also for being a controversial figure, what Frida Kahlo is probably most known for by the majority of people is her looks. Her virgin brows and facial hair paired with a unique hairdo and her fondness for traditional indigenous dresses. Frida Kahlo was a complex and complicated person, misunderstood by the people who dislike her just as much as by the people who glorify her. But in this video we're gonna focus on her divisive looks. Anything else would be far too much for the purposes of this video anyway. So at the beginning of the painting process, I focus on the darkest areas of the face, starting with the eyes, the eyebrows, the lips, and also the shadow under the nose. After that, I move on to paint the shadows under the jawline and the cheekbones. I take my time to paint some of her iconic facial features, and I try my best to capture some of their expression right from the beginning, before I move on to any other parts of the face. After that, I move on to fill out the rest of the face. I don't spend too much time on this since I will come back to repaint most of what I'm painting here anyway. So I'm just putting color next to color, emphasizing the different colors and temperatures of her skin tones, like the bluish green around her mouth or the red of her cheeks. One thing to point out is that I'm not finishing an area before I go on to the next. While you certainly could paint everything in one layer, I really can't recommend doing that, because you miss out on a lot if you do. Especially when painting faces, and especially faces with skin tones as complex as this. You always trade off something when you decide to finish a face in one sitting. Whether it's vibrancy and texture that come from paint building up in layers, or accuracy and proportion that come from adjusting things each time you repaint an area. All of these things are pretty essential when you try to capture reality in a painting, and I wouldn't really recommend trading them off. At least not when one is painting something as complex as a human face. Next I move on to the iconic flowers in her hair, but I don't spend too much time on these since it's almost impossible for me to properly paint flowers in one layer on such a small scale and on a canvas panel. The one thing that makes flowers visually interesting is capturing all the layers of the flower petals and how light interacts with them. And that is something that's not really possible on a canvas panel like the one I'm using here. Everything always tends to look soft. You can't really paint sharp edges, and the texture of the canvas always is in the way of creating a believable surface illusion. I would definitely have preferred to paint this on a wood panel, but then again, this is just a study or a sketch for me, and if I really want, I can still do that in the future. So I consciously leave out the background until I know that I won't be making any major changes to the figure. Instead, I go back to rework some of the areas and I make sure to adjust anything that wasn't quite right on the first pass. I go back to where I started and I put another layer of skin tones on top of what I already established. I make sure to only paint what I really need, making sure to make corrections to color or proportions only when necessary. You don't want to paint over everything you already created. You only want to tweak it and let the layers underneath shine through. Now, I know that upon first glance, Frida Kahlo might just look odd to many people. And I can see how that might be the case. But if you just look a bit longer and dive a bit deeper, you might start to notice that there's actually something hidden beneath that first layer. If you look through some old photos of her or watch the few black and white videos that are out there, you might be surprised to find that she wasn't that unusual looking or unattractive. To the contrary, she was actually a quite beautiful woman, despite her imperfections, or maybe even because of them. Frida embraced her imperfections and also used them to her advantage. She obviously got a lot of ridicule for them, but along with that, also a whole lot of attention. There's something deeply attractive about her that becomes even more attractive once you know a bit more about her story. The more you know about her, the harder it gets to resist her appeal. When she was 6, she contracted polio, and that illness left her right leg shorter than her left. As a young woman, she was in a horrific bus accident, which shattered her ribs, legs and collarbone, and after that she was constrained by a plaster cast, unable to walk for months, and she ultimately had to deal with the consequences and pain for the rest of her life. She also wasn't neglectful, as some might imagine. Her facial hair and her virgin brows, or anything else about her, isn't really the result of laziness. It's carefully orchestrated. As I've mentioned, she embraced her imperfections, even reinforcing them by, for example, painting over her eyebrows to emphasize them even more. Knowing more about her and then going back and looking at some of her photos completely changes one's perspective on her. Her odd and stern gaze suddenly transforms into self-confidence and maturity. Her imperfections turn into expressions of personality and character. And her overall impression slowly turns from unappealing to interesting to quite attractive. Okay, so what I do next is something that goes back to the idea of contrasting. I paint a bluish halo around the face and the hair, and the reason why I'm doing that is that I already decided for the background to have a warm green color. What I want to do is mirror the interplay of cool and warm skin tones in the background. So I paint a blue halo, knowing that when I start to paint the background, some of it will show through, making for a nice vibrant contrast. And that brings us to the background, which, to be honest, probably was the hardest part of this painting. Finding the right green tone proved to be much harder than I anticipated. And the reason for that is that the colors on the palette always look different on the canvas. Once you put color next to color, everything changes. Blues can look green, cool colors can look warm, and dark colors suddenly look bright. What I was looking for is a green tone that would not only complement the warm and red pink tones of the flowers, but also contrast well with the blue color that I already painted around the figure. Finding a color that was close to what I had in mind actually took me a few tries. In the end, it's still not exactly the way I envisioned it, but that's also okay. Just because it's not exactly how I wanted it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. So, after painting the background and introducing some abstractions and textures to the painting, all that's left for me to do is make some corrections here and there, until I feel that I found the right balance between all the components that make up the painting. In this case, I decided to finish the portrait by using a technique called Scumbling. Scumbling is a painting technique that involves dry brushing a layer of thin oil paint over already existing layers. And as you can see, the result of this little trick is quite impressive. I'm going over the face with thin layers of oil paints, and in my case here this has several beneficial effects. Not only does it soften the transition from one color to the next, which ties all the flesh tones together, but it also creates yet another layer of paint that gives the skin even more vibrancy, resulting in a much more harmonious and interesting representation of skin. Asymmetry, roughness, simplicity, modesty, intimacy, and the integrity of natural objects and processes. Appreciating these things ultimately lets us find beauty in our daily lives, and it lets us appreciate the way things are, rather than what we think they should be. The beauty of someone like Frida Kahlo can be described as the beauty of imperfection. And finding beauty in all things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete isn't a new concept. While the ancient Greeks were always reaching for perfection, always striving to emulate a perfect archetype, the beauty of imperfection has been part of Eastern philosophy, art, and aesthetics, and that for centuries. And the beauty of Frida, indeed in a way, is not unlike the Japanese art of kintsugi, where cracked pottery is filled with gold-dusted lacquer in order to highlight the beauty of its age, and its damage, and its imperfection. The attention is drawn to the cracks as part of the beauty, and just like how Frida repainted her eyebrows, the cracks in the pottery are repainted. The flaw is not hidden, but instead it is highlighted. And that sometimes can be one of the most beautiful things. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and yeah, have a good one.